No matter how you start, it's important to finish strong, or at least finish memorably. If you can't do that, well, you could at least end on a joke, right?
My nipples hurt, oh goodness me!
No matter what, you should never end in a way where everything is completely undone in the next movie. That's not gonna fly. One of the biggest strengths of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is its ability to somehow maintain momentum from one film to the next.
Absolutely ridiculous.
How do they do this? By ending each movie strong and hinting at the future, of course. But not all endings are created equal. While the MCU has been an unstoppable hit machine, some endings are better than others. And just so we're all on the same page, when we say final scene, we're talking only about the first thing we see before the credits roll. The mid and post-credit scenes don't count for this video. So only the final scene before the credits hit the screen. Got it? So here are our rankings of every MCU final scene from worst to best. Buckle up, everybody.
Don't make me come down there, you punk!
While on its worst day, the MCU can still deliver an enjoyable movie. There's a lot of disappointment to go around for Iron Man's third and final solo movie. Packed with no less than 3 Iron Man foes, the amount of focus each got was an inversion of how iconic they were. We got a kind of AIM and a fake Mandarin, and a real Aldrich Killian and the Extremis Project. Some of the developments were so ill-received that they were undone, like the Marvel one-shot All Hail the King, which assured us that there's a real Mandarin out there. Also undone was the movie's ending, where Tony destroys all the Iron Man drones, only to have them show up again the next time we see Iron Man in Age of Ultron. The only solo Hulk movie goes all the way back to the early days as the second movie in the MCU, and the only one distributed by Universal. It was a different look for the MCU and for the Big Green Menace. The biggest difference, of course, is Bruce Banner, who's played by Edward Norton. The movie saw the ever-loving Hulk squaring off against Abomination in the streets of New York before slipping away from General Ross to the snowy plains of British Columbia. It was a nice nod to when the Hulk introduced the Wolverine to Marvel Comics while trying to hide out in the wilderness of Canada. But it was all undone when Natasha showed up to recruit a Mark Ruffalo Banner in South America, who never mentioned Betty Ross again. The end credits for Ant-Man and the Wasp was maybe the most anticipated end credit scene since Ragnarok. We were still in shock over the ending of Infinity War, with our heroes losing and half of the universe turning to dust. We were anxious for clues for what was next in the only contemporary movie to happen between Infinity War and Endgame. It's a good thing that it was such a memorable moment, because the moment that preceded it was easy to forget. Scott gets his tracker taken off when his house arrest comes to a close, and then Ben Foster and Ghost go their separate ways after Janet Van Dyne has stabilized Ghost's molecules. While it wrapped up the movie, with Endgame on the horizon, it was afraid to set up anything else. The greatest trick that Stan Lee and Marvel pulled off with Tony Stark and Iron Man is getting us to root for someone who has things go their way normally. There are plenty of billionaire superheroes, but most of them are either broody or self-serious or view their wealth as a responsibility. Tony is the cocky rich guy we usually root against, but instead he became the marquee character for the MCU. In Iron Man 2, he got one of those wins in the final scene when the senator he harangued in the opening is forced to pin a medal on Tony and Rhodey after saving the day. It was a cute ending, but a little empty until we found out that the senator is actually a member of Hydra in the Winter Soldier. Hail Hydra! Doctor Strange had a long walk to the MCU. Way back at the beginning of the shared universe with Iron Man, all the rage in superhero movies was realism, and a Sorcerer Supreme didn't really fit the bill. Thor had to skirt around it by using advanced technology, and the Arthur C. Clarke idea that sufficiently advanced technology would look like magic. But also, Frigga was raised by witches, so yeah. The Good Doctor was name-dropped in Winter Soldier, but didn't debut until Phase 3. Unfortunately, by then, the MCU had to step on the pedal with the Infinity Saga. The pressure permeated everything from Age of Ultron forward. This led to an awkward expositional name drop about the Infinity Stone in the Eye of Agamotto, after being coy about the previous 4 stones. Alright, this movie just came out, so if you haven't seen it, there will be spoilers. So if you want to remain spoiler-free, you might want to ride that skip button ahead until you see Ant-Man. Also, spoilers, Ant-Man is next. Okay, we're all on board? Perfect. Peter Parker doesn't have a lot of luck in love, both romantically and otherwise. That is until Tiger scored the jackpot with Mary Jane Watson. The MCU doesn't have a Mary Jane Watson, but it does have MJ and the adorable teen romance in Far From Home. Having a superhero boyfriend is probably cool, but it turns out this MJ might prefer sticking to the bus as she screams her way through some web swinging. One of the biggest challenges in creating the Marvel Cinematic Universe was the perception that Marvel had sold off all its marketable characters and only had leftovers. Outside of the more recognizable leftovers like Captain America and the Hulk, there was concern that their heroes wouldn't be marketable enough to sustain a franchise. Little did they know. Speaking of little, perhaps the biggest proof that Marvel had plenty in the tank was the turn to the hero formerly mocked on Saturday Night Live into a blockbuster starring Paul Rudd. What it also introduced to us is Lewis's storytelling technique. It's how Lewis let the gang know about the job stealing the suit and was revisited at the end, setting up Civil War by telling Scott that Sam Wilson, the Falcon, was looking for him. Thor: The Dark World isn't on the top of many people's lists when it comes to MCU movies. His Phase 2 outing was a little on the forgettable side. Well, except for it's important in the Infinity Saga, introducing the Reality Stone in the form of the Ether. The short story is that when the Nine Realms aligned, Jane Foster ended up somewhere she shouldn't be when she stuck her hand where she really shouldn't, and got infused with the Ether, meaning she had to go to Asgard. There were also some dark elves. It was a whole thing. During that whole thing, Loki sacrificed himself to avenge his mom. Only he actually didn't, of course. It turns out that right before the credits rolled, Loki had survived and was posing as Odin. Thor has maybe the biggest journey over the course of the Infinity Saga. He had some regal beginnings in that first Thor movie, with Asgard sitting at the center of a centuries-long reign over the Nine Realms, and the heir to the throne was a brash warrior with a hammer first and ask questions later attitude. That kind of brashness leads to a war with the Frost Giants, and Thor being grounded from his hammer and banished to Midgard. New Mexico specifically. Thor learned humility, met some swell humans, bonded with old friends, got his hammer back, and learned that maybe he has more learning to do, telling his dad that he's not yet ready to rule. One of those main titles that Marvel sold off before creating the Marvel Cinematic Universe was the spectacular Spider-Man. The sale of the movie rights to Spider-Man was actually key to keeping the lights on at Marvel. With two franchises, it didn't seem likely that he'd ever join his Marvel stablemates. But oh, how fortunes change. Soon, Marvel Studios was the big guy on the block, and Sony needed a hand. But how would the MCU Sony Spider-Man stand out? First, he was younger, and so was his Aunt May. Also, in a parallel to the iconic reveal in Iron Man, more on that later, his identity was not going to be a secret to his doting aunt. Mostly because Peter's spider sense doesn't work on her, because she never means to harm him. Ah, that Peter tingle, eh? Captain Marvel has the distinction of being both a latecomer to the MCU and an early entry. That's all thanks to the magic of the period piece. And the 90s, baby. As a result, Captain Marvel was the answer to a bunch of questions you didn't know you had, like Project Pegasus, what S.H.I.E.L.D. was doing with the Tesseract, and why Nick Fury and Agent Coulson were so nonchalant around superheroes. It turns out that Coulson was right, this wasn't their first rodeo. The answer to the new question, where has she been since the 90s, was that she was out there solving space problems. The final scene gave us the final answer to the question we didn't know we had, where the name Avengers came from. It turns out that it wasn't the Wasp. Age of Ultron had to do a lot of things for the MCU, perhaps too many things. Its first goal was to up the ante from the Avengers and introduce one of its most iconic and enduring foes, Ultron, if only briefly. It also had to kick the Infinity Saga into high gear with Thor taking a vision bath and Scarlet Witch showing Iron Man a vision of the Endgame. With all that weight, it's easy to get caught up on what Age of Ultron might not have delivered, but there are some things that Age of Ultron managed to deliver on. It introduced us to some perennial Avengers, Scarlet Witch, Quicksilver, and Vision. But don't get too attached to Quicksilver. In the last shot, we get half of the phrase we've been waiting for, Captain America telling the new Avengers team to assemble. Thor Ragnarok was a complete tone change for the God of Thunder. The tone might have been lighter just to keep us from being overwhelmed by how grim things got for Thor. In rapid succession, he lost his father, his hammer, and his homeland. It was a lot to take in. After finding out that he had a sister, and that sister was determined to rule Asgard no matter who she had to kill, he was forced to trigger Ragnarok, the Norse end times, to stop her. With the help of his new friends Valkyrie, Meek, and Korg, and his old friend from work, the ever-loving Hulk, he did just that. He lost an eye, but he gets another one later from a rabbit. It's a long story. The ending brought Thor's journey full circle as, ready or not, he was able to accept the throne of Asgard, if only temporarily. Captain America as a character goes all the way back in time, when Marvel was known as Timely Comics. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby came up with the idea of putting America's Nazi-punching hero on ice and having him join us in our modern world with all its moral complexities. While there have been a few attempts to bring Captain America back, they're more or less forgettable. With Rocketeer director Joe Johnston returning to that World War II era serial look, we got a memorable rendition of Captain America's iconic origins in the First Avenger, including that final scene where the unfrozen Cap runs out into modern Times Square and realizes he's 70 years late for that date he had with Peggy Carter. For Captain America's second outing in a solo movie, the idealistic superhero and poster child for the greatest generation was placed in unfamiliar territory. Part superhero movie, part spy thriller, Cap found his idealism at odds with the compromises to those ideals that emerged from the SSI and the organization S.H.I.E.L.D. that Peggy had helped create. He also learned that Hydra was true to their word: cut off one head and another grows back. Apparently right in your own organization. Thwarting Hydra's plans for S.H.I.E.L.D. changed everything. S.H.I.E.L.D. was in shambles. Nick Fury became dead to the world while he hunted out the last remnants of Hydra. And Steve and his new friend Sam Wilson set out to find Steve's old friend Bucky. The shockwaves from that movie would resonate all the way to the end of the Infinity Saga. If Ant-Man was the superhero that people made fun of, the Guardians of the Galaxy were complete unknowns. That is, until director James Gunn brought the team of misfits in space to the big screen and made them instant favorites. It took the director of Misfit Films to tell the story of misfits who became family. Quill had lost his mother to cancer, Drax and Gamora lost their family to Thanos, Groot was the last of his kind, and Rocket was the only one of his kind. The end sequence of Volume 1 underlined these relationships beautifully. Quill gets a new mixtape from his mother. The Xandarians are saved. Yondu isn't as mad as you'd expect after having been cheated out of the Power Stone. And the twig that Rocket saved after Groot sacrificed himself began to take root and dance his way into our hearts. There was a lot of anticipation for the first team-up of the Marvel Cinematic Universe when the Avengers hit theaters. Fortunately, it delivered in spades. While the team took its time to actually team up, once it happened, the action was epic, culminating in a showdown so amazing that the MCU decided to visit it twice. Of course, after the epic team-up, the superheroes were destined for more solo efforts. While comic book readers are comfortable with this convention, the MCU needed to introduce it. They did that by giving us the architect of the Avengers Initiative, explaining how it'll work as the heroes went their separate ways, knowing that they'll come together again when the world needs them. Well, them coming together when the world needed them was the plan anyway. After saving the world a couple times, people started to realize that the Avengers tended to save the world from threats that it also introduced. Thor introduced his trickster brother to Earth, Tony Stark and Bruce Banner created Ultron, and a third of the villains of the MCU are people that Tony Stark pissed off. This leads to the Sokovia Accords and a civil war between the Avengers, made worse by the manipulations of Helmut Zemo and an unfortunate revelation about Cap's buddy Bucky's past mission, the one to kill Tony Stark's parents. After an epic fight between the Avengers, the ending saw them torn apart, with Rogers sending Tony a phone telling him to call him when he needed him. Shouldn't have hesitated, Tony. Make the call, pal. If the first Guardians was an attempt to bring the group of misfits together as a family, the second Guardians movie set about teaching them what family means. Part of that involved Peter meeting his actual father, who turned out to be a planet-sized jerk. Not metaphorically, he was literally a jerk the size of a planet. But while Ego the Living Planet might have been Quill's father, he wasn't his daddy. Not that Yondu was a model daddy. That usually involves less threats about being eaten. Yondu did give up a lot to raise Quill, though. Often betraying his own crew, he was also exiled from the Ravagers for taking Quill in the first place. But when Kraglin sends the word of Yondu's sacrifice, the Ravagers show up and give him a proper Ravager send-off. He really was David Hasselhoff, wasn't he? T'Challa, the Black Panther, is another one of these characters that is teased for a really long time before he finally made it to theaters in his own solo movie. When he did finally have a solo movie, T'Challa and Wakanda exceeded expectations, especially in its villain. Killmonger's plan was to arm an army with advanced Wakandan weaponry to cause a revolt. But it wasn't run-of-the-mill taking over the world he was after. He was trying to right a wrong. He felt that Wakanda's self-imposed isolation had contributed to the suffering and exploitation of their neighbors when they could have prevented it. Black Panther ends with T'Challa acknowledging that part of Killmonger's plan, but instead of weapons, T'Challa shares Wakanda's knowledge. All the way back in 2008, before there was an MCU and characters like Thanos were household names, fans had no idea what to expect from a superhero shared universe. What we got was a note-perfect Tony Stark from Robert Downey Jr., a fantastic Iron Man suit including the Mark I armor, and a fantastic start to the MCU. But were they going to go with the comic book story of Iron Man being Tony's bodyguard? And would anyone buy it? The answer is no. Instead, Tony ended his first MCU movie and his last by announcing, "I am Iron Man." Over the course of 23 MCU movies, the good guys have had a pretty good track record. There's one qualified W for the bad guys in Helmut Zemo and his plan to destroy the Avengers from the inside. That win for the bad guys set up the ultimate bad guy with the ultimate win. When Thanos made his final push to collect the Infinity Stones and kill off half the universe, the team was fractured. Even knowing Thanos was coming, Tony Stark was reluctant to make that phone call to Captain America. The divided Avengers weren't able to stop the Mad Titan, and the movie ended with the Avengers watching beloved characters fade to dust. We had to wait a whole year to find out how we'd get the dusted back. That wait turned out to be totally worth it. Endgame was an epic conclusion to 11 years and over 20 films, with all roads leading back to Thanos. Thanks to the magic of time travel, the Avengers and other members of the MCU were able to revisit key moments in the Infinity Saga to collect their own Infinity Stones and snap everyone back to existence. The trip down memory lane was only the beginning, though, leading to the epic all-hands-on-deck final battle. But what really pulled the heartstrings is the final fate of Captain America. Tasked with putting the stones back in their own time, Cap decided to stay there, finally getting that dance with Peggy that we all wanted him to have. You earned it, Cap. You earned it. And those are our rankings of every MCU end scene from worst to best. Do you think we nailed it? If not, what's your order? Let us know in the comments, and while you're there, why not subscribe to CBR? It'd be a great ending, don't you think? Thanks for watching.